that the Buddha in his teachings outlines these 7 qualities, these 7 what he calls factors of awakening. At least this is how they've been translated from the Pali language, as fruits of our Dharma practice, of our mindfulness practice of meditation. And largely, they're not just fruits, but they are indicators that we have taken our practice to such a depth, to such a level, where these factors are self-arising. Yeah? We're not creating something that wasn't there before. We're not just kind of sort of trying to come up with something new and say, okay, here's where I'm going to shift from my life, from responding in a way where I'm jittery and agitated and or sleepy, right now, to become this. But rather, it's a way of of uncovering this very natural well, this ground of our own well-being that is self-evident, right? So that's very important. And the Buddha wants us to know that this is the underlying nature of mind is ever present. It's just so subtle and refined that it takes us refining our own consciousness, our own mind, to remember, which is the meaning of sati, of mindfulness, to remember that this is who we are, that this is this kind of state of what we call non-self or emptiness, where the quality, when those filters aren't in the way, obscuring our mind, are more readily available, and they're self-arising because they are already there. Otherwise, we would never be able to experience them when we practice. We would be trying to create something new that doesn't exist. And of course, we don't have to do that. So these factors of awakening are kind of revealing to us our own underlying nature. And so, of course, the first one was mindfulness itself, this capacity to simply be bear in mind, bear witness, if you will, in a way that is relaxed and open and unfiltered and non-reactive and non-judgment, just this very natural form of awareness that is self-evident. And that includes the body, being aware of feelings, being aware of breath, what we call shamatha practice, uh, or calm abiding that arises from concentrative attention, balanced just right. Last time we talked about the lute parable, the teaching by the Buddha, that our meditation should be like a finely tuned string on a lute, not too tight, not too loose. So we want to apply just enough effort to remain and yet otherwise be fluid, flexible, and largely effortless, so that our intonation, if you will, our spiritual intonation, vibrates at just the right frequency, where we can find that our energy, which is then the third factor of awakening, our energy is really well balanced, and we have a sense of flow through our meditation. Um, the one before that, though, the one after mindfulness, which oftentimes is translated as vipassana or vipassana in the Tibetan tradition in Mahayana, is really investigating phenomena, in insight into the nature of our mind. So it's inquiry, and I like to call it insight into inquiry. The third, then, again, energy, often translated as energy. And today we arrive at the fourth, which is joy. So, um, and I must say, this was a good opportunity for me. And I've taught this often in the past, especially doing the mindfulness teachings. And this time I felt as if it was really important to do a really good sort of deeper dive into the distinctions between joy and happiness. They are not the same thing, and yet they are interchanged by authors, writers, teachers. If you ever kind of come across, this notion of happiness as being flourishing, or joy, the natural state of joy that arises from meditation, and then read further, oftentimes the two words will be sort of interchanged. There isn't much clarity on what is the difference, the distinction between these two. And so, um, joy and happiness, there actually is a term in the Sanskrit, piti sukha. Piti sukha, P-I-T-I. It's a compound word. P-I-T-I hyphen sukha, S-U-K-H-A. Piti sukha largely means joy, happiness. So the two are together. joy, happiness. But they are distinct for a reason. Yeah. So I'm going to read you something from this lovely book that someone gave me as a gift years ago. I haven't really cracked it open in a while, and I thought, wow, today is the perfect day. It is called the Book of Joy, actually. And joy here is not a person, it is the state that we are talking about. I suppose it could be a person. I do know a person named Joy that is quite joyful. But this book is, let's see, this was published um, in 2016. And it is a book written by largely three people, a conversation between the Dalai Lama, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So it's these two luminaries from these two very different religious traditions in dialogue about joy and suffering. It's not just about joy, but it's about adversity and suffering. And it's a delightful read. If you haven't read this before, it's really quite uplifting in many ways. Um, and then the third one who edits this, who also does the writing of the commentaries, is a man named Douglas Abrams. And so he's the one, I think, who compiled a lot of this wonderful material. He was there as they were in dialogue with each other and recorded them and then compiled this lovely book. So Douglas Abrams, about uh, in the first chapter of this book, he kind of endeavors to explore the depths, the levels of this concept that we call joy or piti, not pity, but piti. So here's what he writes. This is on page 33 of this text. What is this thing called joy? And how is it possible that it can evoke a wide range of feelings? How can the experience of joy span from those tears of joy at birth to an irrepressible belly laugh at a joke to a serenely contented smile during meditation? Joy seems to blanket this entire emotional expanse. Paul Ekman, famed emotion researcher and longtime friend of the Dalai Lama, has written that joy is associated with feelings as varied as this: pleasure of the five senses, amusement from a chuckle to a belly laugh, contentment, a calmer kind of satisfaction, excitement in response to novelty or to challenge, relief following upon another emotion such as fear, anxiety, and even pleasure, wonder before something astonishing and admirable, ecstasy or bliss, transporting us outside of ourselves, exultation at having accomplished a difficult or daring task, radiant pride when our children earn a special honor, unhealthy jubilation or schadenfreude, relishing in someone else's suffering, elevation from having witnessed an act of kindness, generosity, or compassion, gratitude, the appreciation of a selfless act of which one is the beneficiary. In his book on happiness, Buddhist scholar and former scientist Matthew Ricard has added three other more exalted states of joy: rejoicing, such as in someone else's happiness, what Buddhists call mudita or empathetic joy; delight or enchantment, a shining kind of contentment; and spiritual radiance, a serene joy born from deep well being and benevolence. So, this is quite a range, and I tend to think that in those descriptions, there's also quite a bit of happiness as well. Now, one of the things that often we find in Buddhist texts, in translated Buddhist texts, is that this word piti, um, or joy. So Analayo, the great Buddhist scholar who has done the translation of Satipatthana, the Mindfulness Sutra, brilliant work. He's written entire books on it. He translates this word as joy. Others, however, translate it as rapture. Rapture. And one of the categories I just read by Paul Ekman, who's actually a brilliant neuroscientist, brain researcher, and also very accomplished Buddhist practitioner and meditation teacher, um, uses the word bliss or ecstasy. And so, in this context, this concept of bliss, ecstasy fits well with rapture. So, how is it possible that rapture, bliss, all of these qualities are subsumed, if you will, under one word, joy? And what happened to happiness? Um, so, joy, I looked this up today. Joy arises from the Latin word from rejoice. Rejoice. And the word rejoicing, which by the way is also included in this list, this concept of rejoice um, really has this sort of feeling of delighting, of pleasure, and really is quite focused on a feeling. Now, is this feeling temporary? Is this feeling more permanent? According to the Buddha, piti is something that is long lasting. It's not just a momentary, fleeting experience, but it's a quality that once we reach this point of what is called awakening, that it is a constantly accessible to us. It's never far away. We may not be focusing exclusively on it every moment, but it is self evident. It's part of our way of being in the world. And if you've ever come out of a really deep mindfulness practice, you may experience that for quite a while afterwards, especially if it was a really good practice or you were on retreat after many practices that you felt really helped you, there's this longer lasting residue of the practice that is life giving and energizing and relaxing all at once. Joy is part of that too, a sense of this. So, what is the thread that wraps a lot of these things together? And it is definitely a sensory experience at one level, something that is stimulating in some way, right? At various levels and motivated by various mind states. So, for example, Paul Ekman here in this writing includes a sense of jealousy or Schadenfreude, taking delight in other people's misfortune. How on earth can that lead to joy? Well, in Buddhism, it's not real joy, right? It's one of the afflictions. It's one of the poisons, if you will. Um, so I wouldn't say that that is a good definition of joy, but it is a sensory experience nonetheless. But the root of it is based in afflictive state or in suffering or in discontentedness or in ego, any number of these things that can sort of color our view and our motivation, as opposed to empathetic joy, which is this open, free, true delight in the good fortune of others as part of the four boundless abodes of loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and empathetic joy, that these are boundless qualities arising from the good heart that is awakened and fully present in wholesome ways. Um, so, piti, joy here, this factor of awakening, is actually stimulating. Yeah. Happiness, on the other hand, is that which allows a sense of deeper well-being. It's an easefulness. It is a sense of satisfaction and contentment. In some ways, the happiness itself is discussed in the texts and in the commentaries as being more of a what we might call an affective trait or a deeper feeling state that is long lasting. Joy maybe is an expression of that in certain ways. Now, how this relates to mindfulness practice and to meditation is that we that this notion of piti sukha arises. Both qualities are present when we are really sort of deeply rooted in a really open and relaxed state of mindfulness. The quality of bliss, this sense of letting go that leads to a sense of stimulation of energy in our practice, and yet it's so sort of soft and like a glow, like a sun, like an afternoon sun, just giving us this warmth of glow that also brings us a feeling of energy, as opposed to happiness, which is this deeper sense of easeful well-being that abides. So, uh, in sort of all of my work in sort of dissecting a lot of these terms and how we use them, this is a really good way to distinguish that the piti um, is this quality that also encompasses a stimulation in our meditation, but it's a stimulation with right intention. Sometimes we can feel sensual pleasure when we're sitting in meditation. Maybe we start craving chocolate again, or some other thing that is pulling our senses, and that too is piti, but it's a very gross level um, quality that is rooted in attachment, as opposed to a sense of energy we get by fully letting go further into a state of mindfulness. That kind of open, energized quality of clarity is also that quality of joy. It's a delight that is filled with a wholesome motivation. It's an energized sense of flow. Yeah? So all of that under joy, this simple term, happiness is also present. This sense of deep, what I would characterize as a balance, a state of feeling really in a flow and in a sense of balance, and the ease that arises from this balance, the sense of well being. So the two are very much intertwined conceptually. Uh, and as I think, as the Buddha uh, taught us in other texts, that these various qualities become one experience when we're really abiding in an openness, a natural awareness, a mindful sense of hosting, if you will, that we're not sitting there going, okay, here's joy, here's happiness, and putting everything in the right corners. It doesn't matter anymore. All is one as we abide in natural, gentle awareness. So, but for the purposes of helping us understand the nature of our mind states, he does break these things down for us. So I'll stop talking in a moment. We can dive into practice. The main thing, and there is this Theravadan monk, Ajahn Brahm, who has this lovely little book called Mindfulness, Bliss, and Beyond that I also consulted earlier today. His main point around joy is that, and I really value this, I think this is very consistent with the teachings, is that it is that which arises due to our capacity to let go in meditation. That as long as we're clinging and we're holding on, it's very hard to feel that sense of joy. So, for example, the stimulation, the rapture, the bliss that comes with the thought of chocolate, you know, um, is one form of stimulation, but it's also rooted in attachment. It's also rooted in clinging and needing and wanting. It may also be that aversion spikes this as well. I don't want that. I don't want this, or I'm fighting my own feelings and my own thoughts, and this is the kind of meditation I want to have, and I'm not having it, and so now I'm averse to the experience I'm having, such as it is, and that too can be stimulating, right? So these are sort of unwholesome ways of understanding um, the energy that arises in our practice due to meditation. But the flow, this sort of easeful sense of pleasure, this pleasantness that arises when we are able to fully let go and now just abide at the source, at the center of our mind, or have an experience that Ajahn Brahm calls nimitta. We did this several weeks ago. This direct experience of mind. The Zen practitioners call it suchness or thusness. Very sort of stimulating, energized, and yet supremely balanced. No affliction, just presence, clarity, vibrancy, acuity of mind. Yeah. Um, so, built into this is rejoicing because it feels really good. Built into this can be a sense of rapture because we're fully letting go. It starts feeling really good to practice in the releasing, in the letting go. We can start to feel the sense of natural bliss that arises the longer we sit. And so happiness is part of this, the sense of contentment, of well being, of ease, of balance, a sense of freedom. So, freedom is part of this quality, this kind of happiness that is imbued with joy as well, at its most fundamental level. So, this is what the Buddha meant. Now, sometimes we read through these texts and we go, oh, joy. Oh, I understand joy. It's kind of like it feels good and it makes me happy. But there is so much more to joy as a factor of awakening. Balancing these various things that we just talked about, and it can be confusing. Yeah, if you're still a little confused, not to worry. We know it. When we are able to settle in and abide here, it becomes self-evident, maybe even to the point where there is no distinction between joy and happiness and even suffering at that point. It's just all being held in the source of our awareness.